the newsagents.
Well, Lord Heseltine, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the Newsagents.
Pleasure.
Great pleasure to have you here. And in this slot, we like to try and talk a little bit about contemporary politics, but also view it through the prism of the person we're interviewing's life and their experience of politics. And experience of politics doesn't come much richer than yourself. You first elected in 1966.
That's right.
In the Labour landslide year of that year under Harold Wilson. What was the Commons like in that time?
Post-war, very much a characteristic of speeches, my honourable and gallant friend. You don't hear that now.
Meaning someone who'd served in the military.
Correct, yes. Some very distinguished people who'd had very impressive careers in the military during the war.
And a very male place, more when the parties had greater sort of class base perhaps than they do today as well. More miners on the Labour side and so on, more business people on the Conservative side. What was it, as a young man going into the Commons, what was it like?
Well, I think that not more business people, more Conservatives from the rural agricultural constituencies. That I'm sure. That was always said at the time that the National Farmers Union could change the mind of a government over a weekend, when all the Tory shires went back to their constituencies and were sort of pulverised in some sort of shed in the back end of their agricultural world by the NFU members.
Mm. And going to the Commons in '66. You had long wanted to be an MP already by that stage. How old were you then?
I was 33 when I got into the House of Commons.
And
yes, I had been. I joined the Conservative Party in 1951, unpredictably. I was actually on my way to have coffee with friends, and I saw this hoarding on the other side of the road, Henry Kirby, prospective candidate, Swansea West, and I crossed the road and said, "Can I help?" And then 10 days later I went up to Oxford, and my first day in Oxford I joined the City Conservative Association, the University Conservative Association and the Oxford Union. So it was there. Indeed, someone who taught me when I was 7 said it was obvious you were going to go into politics.
Well, of course, it was famously said about you, I think this is not actually true, but the thing that's always said about you, of course, is that you had this sort of set of ambitions about what you wanted to do in your 20s and 30s and 40s and eventually become Prime Minister in your 50s. That was not true, right? That was a fantasy.
It was a friend of mine who was a journalist called Julian Critchley who created that, and it wasn't true. Rather the reverse, actually. I never thought I'd make it particularly.
Really?
No, I was rather uncertain, I think. But I took the view that if I worked hard, I'd have some success.
And your early life, I suppose, must have been framed by the war.
Absolutely. No, driving here today, incredible. I drove through Piccadilly Circus. I was there the day war ended. And I can remember it now.
In May 45?
In May, later.
For J Day,
Japanese War, yes.
In August 45?
Yes. And, I heard Neville Chamberlain declare war in 1939.
Wow, really?
Standing in my kitchen in Swansea, and there was this wall-bracketed radio. I can remember it quite clearly, and I remember the war. I mean, I remember the bombing, but basically my mother, sister and I followed my father around where he was stationed until he went to Normandy.
And what was that like growing up in the war and hearing that memory vividly? I mean, even you just talking about it even puts my hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, thinking about Chamberlain, all of that, let alone living through. Well, what was it like? How do you think it shaped your politics?
Oh, without any doubt, that experience was part of the conversion to the European cause.
As it was for so many of that generation.
Absolutely. The European momentum really came from the men and women of the prisoner of war camps and the resistance movements who basically continental. It must never happen again. This, after all, was the third war in which France and Germany had torn each other apart in 75 years.
People forget that, of course, there's the 1870s.
The 1870s.
Which in the 40s would still just have been about in living memory, I suppose, for
well,
some people.
Indeed. I mean, the whole 75 years. So quite difficult to remember all three, but
Yes.
you certainly would remember the images and the reputation. And I mean, basically, the politicians, the elder generation, made the decisions, and the young people were sent to die because they couldn't come to agreements. And that's a pretty rough way to live. And there was this absolute determination in Europe, this must never happen again. And that led to the Schuman Plan, which was a concept devised by the French foreign minister to bring the war-making industries under a common control: steel, coal, iron. That was the first step towards the creation of the European movement, led by people like Jean Monnet.
When you were growing up in that time, either during the war, perhaps even when the war would finish, did you assume, or did you fear that you yourself might end up in war?
No, I don't think so.
Because it was just so final by the end.
Yes. I mean,
You must have done your national service, I suppose.
Well,
later.
Briefly in 59, yes. But no, I never thought that there was a risk of myself being involved in a wartime situation.
Would you? What was your household like growing up? I mean, was it very political? Were your mother and father?
No, there was
political?
no politics.
Really?
I mean, I haven't any. Well, I know my father said to me after the war, he was the only officer in his mess to vote Conservative. It's rather interesting.
They all voted Attlee.
They all voted against the Conservatives, despite the incredible veneration of Winston Churchill. It was the memories of the Conservative Party in the 20s.
I suppose you must remember the 45 election. A bit?
I don't really remember it particularly.
You weren't following it as a politics-obsessed
No,
man.
I don't remember it particularly. It was not till the 51 that I remember it quite vividly.
And what was... why were you drawn to the Conservative Party? Your family, you're saying, weren't particularly political. What was it about politics and then the Conservative Party that made you think as a young man, yes, that's the arena that I'd like to enter?
I think it probably is, you climb the ladders that are available to you. And coming from a relatively prosperous middle-class background, that was the obvious place to go. That's the way I'd been brought up. That's the way I felt and thought. And why should I want to change the world? I might want to build on it, improve it, but not a fundamental lurch to the left. There was nothing in my life then that would have made that a likely concept.
And were there any political figures, politicians around that time or even later that you looked up to, that you admired? Anyone that inspired you in particular, or there may have been a speech or some such?
You always come back to Churchill. I mean, even today, I find it incredible to think of the strain of that man in the heat of war. But I never met him. I stood at his funeral and I visited his grave. But
that must have been an extraordinary event in '65. His funeral.
Yes.
Moment of national.
But
collectivity.
The colleague I mentioned, Julian Critchley, in the House of Commons, described it. He said when there was a division in the lobby in the Commons, and Churchill was voting, the members would stand back and watch history walk past. I think that's rather a lovely image.
It's astonishing about Churchill, to go back to what you were talking about in terms of Europe. Both sides on the Europe divide invoke him, don't they? Both sides claim him as their own.
But only one legitimately. We must create a kind of United States of Europe. He didn't say they must create. He said we must create.
So you become an MP in '66, and you're in the Commons as a young MP. Who were your political lodestars at that time? Who did you attach your political personality to, your politics to?
In terms of immediacy, It was rather the other way around, because I found myself working for Peter Walker, who was a very remarkable spotter of people he wanted to have in his team. And he approached me and asked me to organise a tour of the West Country for him.
Well, you were the MP for Tavistock at that time.
I was then the MP for Tavistock, which I did, and that went quite well. Immediately it was over, he said, will you join my shadow transport team? So within no time at all, I was actually speaking from the Tory front bench. It wasn't too difficult, because we'd been absolutely slaughtered in 1966.
That can be quite a help to an ambitious MP if you come in on a year.
MP. Only 11 new MPs, Tories, came in that time. It was a tiny number. And so a lot of the elderly guys had gone off to try and repair their fortunes or the lack. So the competition wasn't that tough. Yeah. But it certainly happened. I was speaking from the Tory front bench almost day one.
Did you find Wilson an impressive figure, an impressive Prime Minister? He was your first Prime Minister when you were there.
No, he was impressive. I didn't admire him or like him, but if you ask him about his skill as a Prime Minister and as a party leader, yes. And his speech, the white-hot heat of the technological revolution, I think in 1973, I think it was a masterly scene-setter for his election in 74.
And indeed, perhaps the only Prime Minister to have had a divided party on Europe and to have navigated it successfully.
Well, he ran away from it, of course,
yes.
Because he said we'll have a referendum.
Yeah.
And so he ran away.
But it went the right way for him, in the sense
it went the right way, but nevertheless, he ran away, and people forget that.
Do you, you've seen so many politicians come and go. It can be tempting, I know, and people, perhaps you should resist this, to think, oh, well, politicians were so titanic in the past. But when I think of politicians of your generation and before, and perhaps even immediately afterwards, if we're talking about the Wilson period, on both sides of the house, whether you've got Wilson, on Labour, Wilson, or Tony Benn, or Barbara Castle, or Jim Callaghan, or Roy Jenkins, and then Conservative side, you had Ted Heath and Thatcher and yourself and many others. They do seem, maybe it's just me because I wasn't around and I'm much younger, but they do seem titanic. Do you think that politicians have declined in quality by comparison to them?
I think the answer to your question lay in your question itself. You're much younger. And I think it's very difficult to look down at a younger generation and see giants. It's much easier to look up to people who have emerged in great circumstances, in dramatic circumstances, weathered the storm, and see them as something larger than life. I mean, it was very vivid for me when I left Margaret's government in 1986. There were giants: Willie Whitelaw, Peter Carrington, Quintin Hailsham. They were giants. When I went back in 1990, I remember thinking, I'm a generation older than these people. And I'm sure that age does make a difference. But
when you look at the cabinet now, do you think that they're of proximate quality to the cabinets that you were in, say, in the 80s?
It's easy to say no, but that's a very unfair thing to say. First of all, I don't know them. Secondly, I am a great deal older than them. And so I just analyse how much easier it is to recognise giants of yesterday than potential giants of tomorrow.
Someone who was a giant of the Commons, whatever you thought about him, was Enoch Powell, of course, and he was around when you were an MP and you were serving under Ted Heath, and of course he made his famous Rivers of Blood speech in 68. You were one of the most, and then and since, vociferous voice against Powell and Powellism.
I was the first Tory to attack his speech. It so happened that he made it on a Saturday, and with Peter Walker I was part of a demonstration against a piece of Labour transport legislation in Leeds. And so, uncharacteristic of the Conservative Party, I was operating on a Sunday, and so got asked, and I was the first to attack Enoch Powell. I think it was a totally immoral speech, because it took the issue of race, which is incendiary throughout history, throughout the world, in all countries, all that. And he made a speech which had this total impression that he was saying something, but there was no proposals or solutions in it. So what he was really doing was whipping up the emotion without trying to solve any of the problems. And why did he do it? Because the Labour Party in government were introducing a race relations legislation. There should be no discrimination in colour, class or creed. And I believed that that was absolutely right. My party was opposing it. And Enoch Powell wanted to make sure they voted that way. Well, Ted Heath sacked Enoch Powell, and 3 weeks later the party supported the legislation. But I had been involved commercially in hotels and employment agencies before my election to the House of Commons. I knew what was going on. Personally, I experienced it, and I believed it was morally wrong and unacceptable. What was going on? Well, I give you two examples. One, a hotel. A very sensible black guy turned up and said, "You've got a room?" Well, we hadn't got a room, and actually we were full. So I said, "But don't worry, I'm quite friendly with the hotel up the road." I rang them and said, "I've got a guy here who wants a room. Have you got one?" "Yes, send him up." I said, "I'll bring him." Took him 100 metres up the road. They took one look and said, "We're full." And the other one was employment agencies. We ran a sort of employment agency for qualified people. And basically we had names and addresses of these people, and we would put their biography on a form and send it to companies that wanted to recruit qualified people, who would tell us what their specification for people was, what their requirements were. And time again there would be no coloureds, no coloureds, no coloureds. So I knew what was going on, and it had to be stopped, and the Labour government were going to stop it. My party was in opposition, and I wasn't prepared to join that. So I defied the Tory three-line whip. But to the credit of the party, it gave in on its opposition and let the legislation through.
Do you think that there are glimmers or echoes of Powell's politics and his rhetoric in our own politics now?
Oh, I mean, Brexit is based on it. That is what Brexit is about. Race.
You think it's based on the sort of incendiary racism that Powell was demonstrating then?
What do you think the statement, there were 40 million Muslims in Turkey who might come into this country, what was all about? Race. And if you were anywhere near the Brexit argument, what they had to do, the circumstance was very depressing economic circumstances. Everybody was feeling pressed after the 2008 world crash. And so you've got to find somebody to blame. Him, her, them, it, bureaucrats, foreigners, Brussels, and immigrants, all wrapped up in the same, do you know what I'm thinking? Do you agree with what I'm thinking? Wink, nod. That was the Brexit case.
Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman, who are, of course, in their own way, son and daughters of immigrants, I mean, if they were here, they would completely reject that themselves. They would say that there was nothing racist about the Brexit campaign. They would say there's nothing racist about wanting to control immigration. So you're at variance with what they would think on that. You think they're wrong?
I know what Brexit's about. Now, both of them would have climbed the ladders of the Tory party when the agenda had been set. They didn't create the agenda. They accepted it.
There's obviously been talk just this week from Suella Braverman about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, changing the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. What do you think about that?
Is this country going to be the first to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights designed in the post-war world to send a beacon of hope to the people behind the Iron Curtain, to say that there will be nations that will stand for human rights, for decency. We're going to be the first major country to abandon that. You only have to ask the question to say that it's unthinkable.
Rishi Sunak doesn't think it's unthinkable. Suella Braverman doesn't think it's unthinkable. She actually thinks it could be a good idea.
You didn't ask them, you asked me.
When you hear the Home Secretary talk about an invasion on our southern coast, do you think that's Powell-like?
Yes.
That sort of language?
Yes.
It's quite worrying then. I
But
mean,
look, let's understand this issue. It is a huge world crisis. And one of the principal sources of the crisis is the world communication system. The people who are coming to this country are not just coming to England. They're coming to the honeypots of prosperity. They know the standards of living here. They may have relatives who are already here enjoying those standards of living. And the conditions in which they are living, in which they're bringing up their children and with their families, are appalling. And they want a share of the action. And that's what most of it is about. And you throw into that global warming, millions, tens of millions of people in coastal communities which are going to be obliterated. You see the floods that are taking place across the world in the most recent, the fires. And it is those are the causes of the immigrant crisis. Now, let's have no doubt, it is already having the most difficult political consequences in one European country after another. So we have to address this issue. And we can't do it alone. The immigrants crossing the Channel from France are not French. You know, imagine if it was the other way around and they were going to France from here and the French said to us, "You've got to take them back." There'd be howls of indignation. And that's exactly how it is in France.
so what should we do?
We need to have a Marshall Aid plan of the sort that the Americans used to help rebuild Europe after the war. So two things. First of all, we need a common frontier around Europe, which we all help to police and man. Secondly, we have to recognize that the constructive way of dealing with this issue is to help create the conditions in the countries from which the people come that are wealth creating and therefore provide the incentives for them to stay where they are.
The Home Secretary said this week that, well, she said before, that no one who is arriving is a refugee, that they're just economic migrants. She's even said this week that some people are lying, pretending to be gay when they're not gay.
Oh, well, I haven't the slightest doubt that people will say anything to get through the system. You've got to realise, put yourself in their position. Think where they've come from. Think what they are faced with going back to. And they've almost got here. And what would you say if in those circumstances?
The Home Secretary wants to send them to Rwanda.
Well, but we'll see whether that happens. But the one thing about that policy is that it's a tiny, tiny microcosm of the whole. I mean, they're talking about a few hundred people out of tens of thousands.
Let's fast forward to the time you were a cabinet minister in the 1980s, working under Margaret Thatcher. You, in a way, became synonymous with levelling up before levelling up was even a phrase, because, of course, your work in Liverpool, London Docklands as well. It's an agenda that you've helped successive Conservative governments with, including the Cameron-Osborne administration. Where do you think we are on levelling up? Do you think it's something that Rishi Sunak still cares about?
David Cameron, George Osborne and Greg Clark were the levelling up administration. And they made real progress Their hearts were in it, their minds were in it, their decisions backed it. Since then, it's coasting along at neutral. And it's a tragedy, because it's so morally right, so economically right, to try and recognise the reasons why so many parts of this country are cut off from the main economic strands of prosperity. It's so obvious why they are. This is my lesson of Liverpool.
Which are? They're distant. They're economically distant from the centre. They lack investments.
Yeah, but show me the problem. Show me the person in charge. And in the Liverpool of 1979, 1981, when the riots took place, there was no one in charge. Everybody knew what was wrong. He was wrong, she was wrong, they were wrong. Never me. And I learnt in the 3 weeks I walked those streets, first of all, there was a lot of things that could happen if someone drove them, but there was no one to do it. And so I spent 18 months finding opportunities, making them happen.
There were some voices, though, weren't there, in the administration at the time, and we know this from the documents that have been published since, who thought that it might be an idea, and I think this included Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor, that Liverpool was consigned to a period of managed decline. Yes. So you were rather a lone voice. Was that a common view in the administration at the time?
This has been, it's a very interesting question. And look, Geoffrey is a good friend of mine, and he understood the arguments about poverty and devolution as clearly as I did. But the Treasury are against anything that costs money. And you can't blame them, because they're surrounded by people trying to get more money out of them.
They're the only tax-raising department. They're the ones who collect the money.
They've got the money, and they don't want to spend it unless they have to. So whatever comes up on the agenda, the Treasury are going to say no. So Geoffrey did write a letter in which would have been come off the shelf, Chancellor, he's at it again, stop it before it gets anywhere. And Keith Joseph was on his side saying, Margaret, we're not an interventionist government, Michael is intervening, But the important point is, what did Margaret do? She supported me. And
so Margaret Thatcher was committed to the agenda.
She overruled Geoffrey and Keith at a meeting of 4 of us in Number 10 and backed my proposal. That was to do London Docklands, and it was the civil service. They were against it as well, because they thought that I was interfering in local government.
So Liverpool owes Margaret Thatcher a debt, which you don't hear very often.
You don't hear very often. You're absolutely right. And so I've always made that absolutely clear, and it's quite interesting. I mean, I go there and people say, "But this was you." I said, "Look, I was a Tory. I was a member of the Thatcher government, and Margaret made it possible for me to do this." And they still shake their heads. They can't just. And it's the same argument about Margaret. What's Margaret's single greatest achievement? Without any doubt, the single European market. And
I want to talk about Margaret Thatcher briefly in a moment, but just on the levelling up question. Obviously, one of the big stories this week has been about HS2 and the Prime Minister mooting and leaks suggesting that the northern leg at least could be cancelled from Birmingham to Manchester, and maybe even the connection to Euston, so you'd have a connection between Birmingham and Old Oak Common. What do you think of that idea, and what do you think the effect would be?
Well, the effect has already been extremely damaging because of the uncertainty. I mean, here you have a clear government policy based on very sound principles of levelling up. And suddenly the question is it going to happen? That's an uncertainty in itself. Then, is it going to half happen? Or is it going to link up with Euston or just outside London? And the people where I live in Northamptonshire, but it's like the same in Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire, who've put up with the environmental damage, with the scarred countryside, with the loss of property values, the noise and all that stuff, and suddenly told, oh, well, don't worry, because we're not going to do it. So those people are not going to be pleased. They're going to be very cross. People
all that sacrifice for nothing.
Yeah, exactly. People north of Birmingham, it's their strategy.
Do you think Rishi
investment? People have spent huge sums of money, of their private money, investment in anticipation.
Do you think Rishi Sunak's government can say that it is still committed to levelling up if it cancels a northern leg of HS2?
Well, he can say what he likes, but that's not the question.
Can
the
he say
question is, would anyone believe him?
Would you believe him?
No. I mean, I know that, look, levelling up is a very difficult thing to achieve. Why? Because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And the levelling up agenda affects the self-interest of very large numbers of people adversely. First of all, local councillors don't like it because they don't want directly elected mayors. Secondly, local MPs don't want it because the directly elected mayors create bigger figures locally than they are. Thirdly, the civil service don't like it because they have functional responsibilities in ministries, and those have to be pooled into a common pot to meet a common local strategy. Ministers don't like it because where they have comfortable secretaries of state functionally divided, they suddenly find it's all been pooled. And so the only way to do this is when people like David Cameron and George Osborne and Greg Clark face up to the opposition and go for it.
Sunak cares about it less than they did, you think?
Well, at the moment, well, look, I was involved in all this in the 1960s when the Redcliffe-Maud report looked at the structure of local government in this country. There were 1,300 local authorities. Understandable, because when they were designed, the only way to get anywhere was on horse or by walking. We got it down to 300. The report recommended 60. We're still at about 300. We've got far too many local authorities, and again, so you've got a huge wall against devolution.
Talking about Margaret Thatcher and her time in government, you serving her for as long as you did, do you think that we misremember Margaret Thatcher now in terms of what she was really like, about what her governments were really about, that she's been lionised within the Conservative Party and we're remembering a different version of her?
Well,
you knew her.
You say we remember. I don't remember. I remember exactly what Margaret was like and what she did, her good points and her bad points. So I can't, if you're asking me, I can only tell you what I think. I can't tell you what we think.
Yes, but you always, that's what I mean. That's why it's so valuable to talk to you, because you actually experienced it.
Yeah, well, look, Margaret was an impressive lady. I didn't particularly like her, but that's not relevant. She was a perfectly good colleague until the row over Westland. Indeed, she told the chief whip at the time, she thought I was her natural successor, and she kept promoting me. So, one's got to see the thing as it was, not as people misrepresent it. But the important thing, what did she achieve? Sale of council houses. I was the minister that did it. Very important. Privatisation. I probably privatised more individual acts than anybody else has ever done. But Margaret was there and in charge of that. Single European market, Margaret did it. And so there were. You come back to the trade union reform. And the interesting thing about the Margaret government of 1979 is that it was Ted Heath's government given a second chance. One has to realise that we were all there in 73-4. And that was a...
When the miners won, when the miners were seen to bring the government down.
Yes, but you've got to now go back to 1968, when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, and they produced a white paper called In Place of Strife.
Jim Callaghan famously.
Jim Callaghan pulled the rug. But the fact is that it was Barbara Castle and Harold Wilson that first identified the over-bridled power of the trade unions in Britain of the time. And it had to be dealt with. Ted Heath tried, much influenced by his wartime experience, with perhaps a determination not to push the thing too far, Ted's government re-elected in 79 with a different leader, we knew what had to happen.
I said Winston Churchill is claimed by both sides of the Brexit divide. Margaret Thatcher is also claimed by both sides of the Brexit divide. Well, where do you think she would have been in the end?
She'd have gone on making these noises about them and foreigners and bureaucrats, but she'd never have left the European market. She created the European market.
You think she'd have been a Remainer, ultimately?
A
reluctant one.
A reluctant Remainer. I mean, what happened? There's no doubt in my mind what happened. She created the single market. Great, huge achievement. And then the concept...
Based on Thatcherite principles in many ways.
Indeed. And self-interest. Not the Germans and the French are not going to fix it this time round like they did with the Common Agricultural Policy, which we then had to accept. So what then happened after the single market was that the forms landed on the small businessman's and woman's desk. Tired at night, their own production manager, their own sales manager, their own finance director, absolutely exhausted, and then there was another form. The popular press picked it up, and Margaret began to say, foreigners, bureaucrats interfering. And so she, having achieved this extraordinary thing, she rode public hostility in her later years and threw into the mix the poll tax. The poll tax, that really was Thatcherism.
We don't have time to get into... I could ask you so many things. I could ask you about the Westland affair and all of the details about it. We don't have time to get into it. But did you ever, in the years since, the many, many years since, and your resignation, after your resignation from the Thatcher cabinet, the famous resignation, did you ever think, you know what, I should have just stuck with it? Because then I might have become Prime Minister myself. I might have been her natural successor.
That argument has been put to me many times. I would have been destroyed by the machinery around Thatcher at that time.
They would have come for you?
They would have destroyed me because, you have to know that the real issue was not Westland. It was whether I had the right to put the case of a British-led European consortium to save Westland to the cabinet. That was the issue. And Margaret had lost 2 earlier meetings with colleagues, and I had won. And it was going to be discussed in the cabinet, but the meeting was cancelled. And I tried to raise it. She wouldn't let me. And out of her handbag came this manuscript, and I can see it now as I talk to you. And what she said was that anyone who's asked questions about this again has got to refer the question to the Cabinet Secretary before they answer it. And I said, Margaret, does that mean that if I am asked the same question by the same journalist as I was asked 10 days ago, I've got to say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I must go to the Cabinet Secretary. She said, yes. To which I said, there is no room for me with honour. And there wasn't, because Bernard Ingham would have been on to his friends
Margaret
in the
Thatcher's press secretary.
On to his friends in the press, he's a man of straw. He's bust. He's finished. That's what they'd have all said. And it would have been, in substance, true.
She must have been so shocked when you walked out.
I'm told that they were.
Must have been an astonishing moment.
The awful thing is, well, 2 awful things. If they had let me put the case to Cabinet and I'd lost, I could have gone back to my colleagues in GEC and British Aerospace and to my colleagues in Europe, and I said, look, I did my best. They heard the case and they said no. Everyone would have understood that's the way politics work. What I couldn't do was to say, I'm sorry, they wouldn't let me put my case.
They forced your hand.
And so I went.
Before, I've got to let you go, like I said, I could talk to you all day. But obviously we're approaching Conservative Party conference this weekend. You've seen a lot of Prime Ministers struggle over the years. Prime Minister's very far behind in the polls. Do you think he's got a chance for the next election, Rishi Sunak?
I think he's got a very difficult circumstance because in the end elections are won and lost on people's well-being economically, and they're not going to be that much better off, if better off at all. The circumstances are extremely unhelpful But what I think Rishi should do at the conference is to confront a principal reason why we're in this difficulty. And he gets great credit for it, because as Chancellor, he saw us through the COVID crisis. And one should not underestimate in any way that, looking back, we can see it was containable. We managed to get through. But nobody knew that when he was facing the decisions he took. And he would have been told, and rumours were, and the documents were everywhere, this thing could get out of hand. And he saved huge numbers of businesses, enormous numbers of jobs, and very large numbers of people's lives at a great cost. And partly that great cost is why we're hemmed in today. And he should be upfront about this and say, look, that's what I did. It did cost a great deal of money. I would do it again today in the light of what I knew at the time and what everyone was saying at the time. And I think he deserves great credit for that.
This long period of Conservative government, though, since 2010, how do you think it will be remembered? Let's assume it does come to an end next year if there's an election. How do you think it will be remembered? You compare it to the Conservative governments of Macmillan and Eden and Churchill in the 50s, and then Heath in the 70s, and Thatcher and Major in the 80s and 90s. How will it compare, do you think? And how will it be remembered?
Oh, I think that it will be seen in the context of a world economic crisis, which, first of all, the immigrant crisis, secondly, the economic crisis. And I think that David Cameron will get great credit for bringing the Tory party back to sanity, and great credit for the devolution agenda, which he enabled his colleagues to pioneer. But I'm afraid that the stain on this government will be called Brexit.
Do you think that will be reversed?
Yes, must be.
How long do you think it will take?
It started.
You think it's already started?
It's already started. Public opinion has moved dramatically. The decision to rejoin Horizon is an indication that this is the direction of travel. But it's early days. But it's easier to answer the question today than it was a month ago. A month ago, none of the big political parties would talk about Brexit. Now, little by little, the debate is opening up.
How do you think we're viewed in the world now?
I think people think we're mad, incomprehensible.
The country overall?
Yes, absolutely.
I think our standing is very low at the moment.
We've abandoned a position of huge prestige and influence.
And Keir Starmer, again, you've seen a lot of Labour leaders. Do you think he'd be a good Prime Minister, from what you've seen?
Look, I'm a member of the Conservative Party.
You still are?
Yeah, of course.
You haven't got the whip in the Lords, though, of course.
No,
Theresa May took that away from you.
But it's quite fun, that, because it was quite obvious that someone in number 10 told Theresa May this had to happen, and so she let it happen, and I know all about that. But the leader of the Lords, Chief Whip of the Lords, was appalled by what they made him do. And he was immensely courteous, and I like him very much. But anyway, when he said, I'm losing the whip, I said, well, am I going to leave the Tory party? He said, oh, no. And he agreed that I should sit on the benches reserved for ex-Conservative cabinet minister in the House of Lords, which I still do. And I get letters from them, full of praise for everything that I've done to help the party and all this sort of thing, and asking for money, signed by Boris. I've got this wonderful letter signed by Boris. Of course, it's a side-to-side appeals letter, but nevertheless, it's quite fun in the circumstances.
Your successor, of course, in your old seat in Henley.
Yes, Boris. Yeah. And I got on very well with Boris, but he's a rogue. He says whatever he thinks will work.
Do you think he was a Remainer deep down, as many people do believe he was, but he just moved with where the wind was going?
That would be the basis of his calculation. I mean, there are these stories of two speeches, one leaving, one staying. Well, if you can get to that sort of stage where you can't make up your mind, you have to write two speeches, it shows that something's going on.
And finally, you talk about still being a Conservative Party member. You've been obviously a member of the Conservative Party for a long time, but there's no doubt that the Conservative Party has moved a great deal in terms of where the centre of the Conservative Party is. In so many ways now, you are something of an outlier, and you have a complicated relationship with your party, or they perhaps have a complicated relationship with you. Does that sadden you?
Yes, but it's the party that's changed, not me. I'm making the same speeches, saying the same things as all those other leaders that I worked for so long. My great fan is Harold Macmillan. He had the courage to tell the British people the truth. I've never been one of those politicians who are so well defined by waiting to see the way the crowd is running and then rushes in front and says, "Follow me."
Lord Heseltine, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.